Welcome back to Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom. This week's show and show notes are both longer than usual, but with very good reason. Hang on, because it's going to be a fun and occasionally wild ride. My guest today for this first show in the Year of the Dog is none other than internationally esteemed writer and lecturer, Mr. Peter Levenda. Peter has a truly massive and very influential body of work, including his groundbreaking China business book, The Mao of Business, and he is considered to be something of a legend in certain circles. For roughly 40 years, he has taken a very rational, scientific, and historical approach to researching topics that are more commonly viewed through a conspiracy theory lens. And he has won the respect of mainstream scientists, academics, and fans around the world as a result, including me, if you can't tell. I was very excited to get Peter on this show. Lately, Peter is probably most well known for his work with former rock star Tom DeLonge of Blink-182 and other bands, and his To the Stars initiative and the Secret Machines creative project. And the To the Stars initiative has been responsible for facilitating the recent high-level U.S. government disclosures regarding the UFO phenomenon, as reported on the front page of the New York Times and other newspapers around the world. Levenda's involvement is an outgrowth of his earlier work, writing extensively on post-World War II issues related to the fate of various very bad guys who escaped Germany and their subsequent roles in the founding of the U.S. space program and other intrigues. But what's most relevant to our show today is Peter's passionate interest in and pioneering role doing international trade with China beginning in 1984. Among other topics, we discuss his early studies doing translations of Chinese alchemical texts as he earned his master's degree and their relationship to Cabalistic material, his over 34-year career working with and traveling throughout China, and his impressions of how the country has grown and evolved as he has met and worked with people from all walks of life here. He has definitely not come to China and been in some expat bubble. He was here before that was even a possibility, really. We also discuss the disconnect between what Peter calls the virtual China, that is what most outsiders conceive of, versus the reality of the actual place. We talk about China's sense of itself and how approaching it with a colonial or antagonistic attitude is a recipe for disaster, how China's own space program will most likely distinguish itself in the very near future. We get a little bit into the broader power dynamics at play in the East versus the West and what a smart China strategy should consider, and much more. We do also cover the To the Stars project somewhat, as well as a few other random tangents that pop up here and there. So it is a relative buffet of Levenda goodness. This one gets very philosophical, but it is also extremely practical too if you want to transact between China and fill in the blank. Peter is very learned on this subject. He is also very funny, and I think we had a wonderful chat. With all due respect to my other guests, I have to say that this is possibly my favorite episode of the show so far, so I really hope you'll give it a listen and that you enjoy it if you do. Also, I am very happy to announce that we have a new international sponsor this week. Stackery is the global leader in international parcel forwarding from the U.S. to anywhere in the world. The way it works is that you shop at any U.S. retailers, then have your packages shipped to your Stackery address in the U.S., and once everything has arrived, Stackery consolidates your stuff and ships it to you anywhere in the world, even China, saving you up to 80% off the shipping costs versus shipping things directly from the stores. Stackery provides free storage, same-day consolidation of your packages, and a tax-free U.S. address for you to use. I am building my very own Stackery shipment from the U.S. to China right now. It's really easy to use their site and to get started. Sign up today via the link in the show notes and use the offer code BIGFISH at the checkout, that's all one word, BIGFISH, to save 10% off your very first shipment. All right, this is a giant intro, but it is a pretty epic show. Don't forget that all the links are also available on the blog page at crazyinagoodway.com. Now, please enjoy my interview with Peter Levenda. Well, I am very happy to be here with Peter Levenda. Peter, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Brennan?
I am great. I appreciate you making the time. I know that you mentioned that you are in writing mode on 3 projects, so I have an idea what that's like to jump out of that headspace and jump into this.
No worries.
Thank you. My traditional first question is, can you tell us, especially for the audience, which is a more general audience, can you tell them a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and for you, why China? What was your interest in China and Asia? And then we will definitely unpack all that.
Okay, cool. Well, I was born in the Bronx a long time ago, and I grew up under very many different kinds of circumstances, holding strange jobs from time to time. I was always interested in writing, and I read voluminously. I read huge amounts of stuff, all kinds of things, fiction, nonfiction, everything else, and really liked writing. I was writing my short stories when I was still in high school, actually in middle school. So I was always targeted in that direction, but people don't often make a living doing that, and I wound up doing other things and got involved in China trade in 1984. But prior to that, I had studied Mandarin in New York. It wasn't easy in those days, in the early 1970s. There were not a lot of places that taught any form of Chinese. And I found a little language institute that did, and I started studying it. And the reason I was studying Mandarin was actually because I wanted to translate books on Chinese alchemical texts that had not been translated into English. And I was fascinated by that, by Taoism in general, and by some of the practices. And I wanted to read that, but there were no translations at that time, or nothing that was accessible, to me. So I went and I said I'm going to learn to at least read Chinese so that I can read the texts, and that began a kind of lifelong interest in China, which began when I was quite young. I mean, my parents had me at a time in 1950 when there was a kind of a romantic idea about China in the United States. There was a China fad kind of in those days. Everything was Chinese. Macy's had these Chinese displays, and it was a kind of an Orientalist fantasy about China.
That's, yeah, funny.
Which is really what it was, I think, more than anything else. But we had, we had a painting in our house. It was a print. I think it's a rather famous one of a Chinese schoolroom, and all these little children, sort of playing around and doing things while their teacher's asleep at the desk. And it made such a tremendous impression on me because it was always there. And we had lamps, like lamps, dining room or living room lamps that were in the shape of, sort of Chinese vases and everything else. There was this Chinese stuff while I was growing up. And the very first restaurant I ever went to when I was still like 2 years old or something, I still remember to this day, was a Chinese restaurant because of the dishes. And they had the logos on them. And that just freaked me out. And I thought that was just the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. And so there was this in the background, but it really didn't cohere into anything like a mission until I began to read about esoteric subjects in Chinese religion and Asian religion in general. And I became fascinated by that. And I love languages anyway. I study a lot of different languages. I learned Latin in school, for instance, and from there to French, and then from French to Spanish, and on and on. So there was something about Chinese that was kind of an affront to me because there was no alphabet,
right.
And it's very tonal, which none of the other languages I was studying was really tonal. And so I said, well, I can do this. I can learn this. This is, you can't keep this from me.
That's optimistic, but you did it.
Yeah, very optimistic, as it turned out. But I did. I went through these deep immersion, courses in Mandarin. And then by 1984, through a series of accidents, I found myself working for a company in New York, just about 2 blocks from the World Trade Center. And it was run by Chinese people, just a couple of Chinese people, and myself. I was the token Aguilo. So that was my introduction to China trade. And then I started going to China, extensively, and we did $1 million contracts at a time when there really was not a lot of competition from other American companies. We competed against the Japanese, or we competed against the Germans, Siemens, for instance, or, so there was that going on. But so here I am in China in the mid 80s, and, someplace that had always fascinated me, and it was quite an experience. I mean, I had spoken with someone who had been an engineer, who had been to China a number of times, a man I respected. And he said, when he realized I was going to China, he said, well, you're going to realize 2 things. One, you're not prepared for it. It's like nothing you can think, nothing you can imagine. It's going to be overwhelming. That's number one. Number two, if you go there once, you'll always go back. And those two things turned out to be quite true. And I started going back constantly. My first trip to China lasted for 3 months. It was supposed to only be for a couple of weeks.
Okay.
But there was so much business going on
Sure.
in those days. And it was so intense that I had to keep buying warmer clothing, and just stay there. And I was based at the old Beijing Hotel, right downtown there on Wangfujing. And, but I was hardly ever there. We were everywhere. We just covered a lot of territory at a time when it wasn't really easy to travel within China. We couldn't get out of the car in a lot of places,
Okay.
And it was that kind of security arrangements were such. And it was a time when you walk down the street as a foreigner and caused traffic accidents. Wow. Because people just there was like a stunning thing, especially in the so-called small towns. 500,000 people is a small town.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. And you walk down. Right.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say you just walk down the street and 10,000 bicycles fall over because they see you crossing the street and they don't know what they're looking at, and you'll go into a crowded restaurant and suddenly it's dead silence because you walked in. I mean, that was the time. So it was a very different time than now. Well, and that wasn't that long ago. It was 30 years.
Exactly. I was going to say, I know from my own China knowledge and, of course, knowing a bit about when you arrived that the opening, I mean, you were here at the very, very, very beginning of that. And I would say that, you were obviously a pioneer in the things you were doing. I'm curious I want to back up 1 second. And I will set this up in the intro that the listeners will have heard already by the time they hear the interview. Part of what's different about this episode will be that we will get into more esoteric topics in a way because, of course, that's sort of your wheelhouse, and it's not a secret among my friends that that's really my wheelhouse too. It's not normally the focus of the show, but I'm especially interested to know what were some of the texts that you were translating.
Wow. Well, some of the texts are now available in translation, so that's a relief. And I think there's been some excellent translations, really, by some China scholars over the last, I would say 15 years or 20 years or so. But I'm trying to think of the names off the top of my head. They were texts that dealt specifically with Chinese alchemy, but from the how shall I put this? From the point of view of the physicality of it, the biological aspects of Chinese alchemy, as opposed to the purely chemical. I think in the texts that I've read in alchemy in China are both. They use chemical metaphors for biological processes, and they use biological metaphors for chemical processes. So you actually do have laboratories, but it's also an interior process. So I started to read all of that stuff, just comprehensively, and I wrote a couple of books about it. My master's thesis, for instance, is about concerns Chinese alchemy.
Oh, okay.
As a means of of ascending heaven. It's called Stairway to Heaven, and it compares Chinese alchemy and some of the metaphors within Chinese alchemical texts to Cabalistic texts, the Jewish mysticism texts. So I started to make these comparisons to show that there was a commonality of symbolism. And what did that mean? And the pace of Yu and the shamanistic practices of China, in the pre-dynastic period that survived, and what did that indicate? What was that about? How did that become incorporated into alchemy? So we can get into the weeds here. I don't think you want to do that.
Probably not for the audience, but has that been published, or is that something that I might have to sweet talk you into sending me a PDF of? Has that been published?
Stairway to Heaven has been published.
Okay.
And in addition, I've also published a book on Thomas Vaughan, which compares the writings of the Welsh alchemist Thomas Vaughan to Chinese and Indian alchemy to show that, in fact, I have some Chinese alchemical drawings from alchemical texts from China next to a drawing that appears in Thomas Vaughan to show that they're almost identical. That they're talking about precisely the same process. And Vaughan could have known nothing about Chinese alchemy. considering the time that he lived, which is, sort of a 17th century England.
Sure.
He would not have known.
No way to travel, really, or
no way to get that information. Yeah, exactly. But the diagrams are so similar. It's uncanny.
Well, that's fascinating. I'll follow up with that offline. I'm not sure if those are available via Kindle or if I would have to track down a hard copy and have it shipped. But I want to read Stairway to Heaven especially. That leads me to a question. I have actually prepared a bit more because typically these interviews are such that, as long as I know a little about the person, then I find my way through it. But I wanted to maximize this opportunity, frankly. So, and because you have a body of work that I'm familiar with, I wanted to key on some certain areas that I know you can speak about. You mentioned how there are similarities in place, and we were talking about how Vaughn could not have known, for instance, but yet he had this awareness, or there was this sync between what he knew and what was happening here. You have said elsewhere that you felt that you knew Hong Kong prior to actually going there the first time, and I can relate to that very strongly myself, both with Hong Kong as well as a few other random places I've traveled that are known to sort of have a very heavy spiritual community, such as Valletta, Malta, or Carthage, Tunisia. I'm interested, what were your initial impressions and sense of place in mainland China when you first started traveling here? And, what do you kind of attribute that to, and how has that evolved in your travels over the last 34 years?
Yeah, they've evolved quite considerably, but the initial impressions were, as you say, this kind of familiarity. Hong Kong seemed very, very familiar. And I don't know what that was. I mean, because of the time that I grew up, you had movies, you had, the Flower Drum Song, you had The World of Susie Wong, you had all this Orientalist stuff that was, portraying China in a certain way. But that really wasn't it. I mean, when I got to Hong Kong, there was this overwhelming sense of nostalgia, as if I had been there before. And I realized when I backtrack a little bit, I mean, I lived in Brooklyn Heights for many years in New York, and Brooklyn Heights was a locus for China traders. There were some buildings that had been built by people who had made their fortunes trading within China. Or trading to and from China back in 200 years earlier or 150 years earlier. So there was that, but that wasn't really very prominent in the landscape. Certainly, you just were not aware of it unless you knew the history. So I can't put my finger on what it was, but Hong Kong was that way. Hong Kong was just sort of intensely. I was familiar. I mean, I'm a New Yorker. Right. So that we had China, right, and we have all of that, but it wasn't the same thing. It was something completely different. It wasn't like I was walking into a city-sized Chinatown. It wasn't like that at all. It was something deeper about the experience. And I know a lot of Chinese people who despise Hong Kong. Right. They can't stand Hong Kong for a lot of reasons, and I can understand that. But for me, it was a different experience. And then going from there, my first trip was to Hong Kong, the old Kai Tak airport, and then from Hong Kong crossing over into Shenzhen, which was a whole other experience. And Shenzhen in those days was the Wild West. I mean, it's nowhere near what it is today. And there was again this overwhelming feeling of this weird sense that you had been there before. And we're staying at a Soviet-built hotel. In Shenzhen. The place is, looked great from the outside, and it's falling apart on the inside, and it's leaking water everywhere, and it's, bare everything and austere and frightening, And so we're staying there, we're having meetings there and doing all of this there. And, I was desperate to walk out onto the street and just to walk around for a while. And my boss, who was Chinese from Shandong province, he said, "You probably shouldn't do that right now." I wasn't aware of the effect because this was the first time that I had crossed over, quote unquote, mainland China. Right. And the effect of a foreigner walking there was not as bad in Shenzhen as it was in northern parts of China, but it was still, pretty bizarre. People did just stare at you openly, and, and all of that kind of thing. But that was then, and, this is now. And now, I mean, I was there, mid-'80s, and consistently for about 4 years, I was in and out of China constantly. And then in the 90s, I set up operations. I actually, for another company, set up offices in Beijing and in Shanghai and Hong Kong and Guangzhou and just everywhere, including in Singapore, Kuala Lumpur. So I was constantly in China in the 90s as well for different companies, but doing a lot of work. And the difference of, for instance, just Beijing from 1984, let's say, till 1994 is two different places. It was just radically different. And then from the 90s till now, of course, there's no comparison. And when I speak to Chinese who are young people, who were born in the 80s, they think I'm talking about a fantasy place when I talk about China in the 80s, you know, coming out of the airport in Beijing, and there's like darkness all around you and fires burning in the distance, you know.
Wow.
It's this weird sort of strange dystopian feel to the place. And being told by my boss, you know, be careful what you say in the hotel rooms. And we would go out to Tiananmen Square and walk there to have, you know, discussions at night about, you know, the deals that we were working on and who's getting what discount and all this other stuff. So we would do that outside. We wouldn't do it inside. All kinds of strange stuff like that we had to do. And, you know, there was no coffee in the whole country.
Right.
You know,
Right.
It was all this stuff was happening. So for my first 3 months in China, I never had coffee. I just drank tea. And when I finally got back to the States, flying back 3 months later, I found that I couldn't manage a knife and fork. And the smell of cooked meat was turning me off, beef, you know, and like for steak. I mean, all kinds of, my system had changed. That won't happen now unless you're going out to the countryside, you know, unless you're spending a lot of time really far from the major cities. But in the cities now, of course, that's just not going to happen. But these are superficial things.
Right.
I think on a deeper level, I met people from every walk of life when I was doing business there, because we went everywhere. We went to small towns. We dealt with big factories, with small factories. I was selling all kinds of equipment from the United States and from Europe into China. I sold Ericsson cables and, into Xi'an, for instance, or, you know, selling equipment to make roofing material from Germany, computer systems from the United States, which was a real pain to do because of all the regulations surrounding shipping technology to China.
Right.
So, you know, it was just an intense time. But you did meet people from every walk of life, from the city, from the country, rich, poor, whatever, the military, local politicians, governors. We had, you know, governors attending signings for our contracts in those days in the 80s. It was that big a deal. And, you know, we signed contracts for a couple of $1 million, which today is not much, but in those days was a huge amount. And you had to deal with a lot of red tape and, you know. So it was a different feeling then than now. There was a lot of politics. The Japanese were very much part of the economic, the trade system in China, and there was a lot of kind of resentment for that, and there was a lot of gratitude that the Americans were finally in China doing business. They much rather would have dealt with, it seemed to me, to deal with the Americans and the Japanese for a lot of reasons, right? The war being one of them, I guess. So there was all this going on, and, you know, there was a different mood. You felt that you were in a country that had just been liberated. Okay. And it was that sense, you know, it was that sense that you're in a country where it's just shaken off something. And I talked to people who fought in war on the other side, you know, people who were there for the revolution, who were there in 49, and they talked to me about how great it was in the first few years after the revolution. And then, of course, there was other things went on and stuff got not so nice, but there was still this pride in being Chinese that was tangible everywhere you went. Sometimes it was antagonism towards you as a foreigner. You got accused of being a carrier of spiritual pollution in those days. Okay. You know, there was that. There was a bit of that going on. There was suspicion. We went to factories and people just automatically assumed we were lying to them about the technology we were going to sell them. So we had to constantly prove and reprove and, you know, show documents and do tests and stuff to allay fears, because their experience of foreigners had been obviously very bad for so long. Right. And so there was this, you know, on the one hand, they were happy to see you, and on the other hand, they didn't trust you. and you had to build trust, and you had to build trust very painstakingly. And I think my experience was such that I had read so much about China, and I carried a copy of the Little Red Book. I could quote Mao, I could quote Mao to the people that I worked with, which broke a lot of ice, believe me. That suddenly made things a lot better.
I don't think that's an icebreaker today necessarily, but I imagine it would have been significant
it was in the
80s, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they were still wearing Mao jackets in the 80s. And every business meeting I had, there was a party member in attendance who didn't really know anything about the technology, but they were there for, political, purity or something. So
that still happens occasionally. Once in a blue moon, I'm in some sort of a meeting today where that's the case.
Oh, okay. So it's still going on.
To a small degree, but it happens.
Oh, yeah, it happens. It happened then a lot. And so it was easy to pick out who it was, too.
Sure. Oh,
in the
sure.
meeting. It's kind of obvious. But anyway, without going into all those details, but that was the sense then. You were there at the beginning of something really important, and that's how it felt. The beginning was really in 49, but in the 80s with Deng Xiaoping and to get rich is glorious and all of this stuff, you suddenly felt they were on the verge of something really important. You felt it in the air. You felt that this is going to explode, and you just knew it. And it was everywhere. The energy of the people, the energy of the country, even in the poorest areas that you might go to, there was an optimism there. There was a determination that you saw, and a lot of pride. And it became even more intense in the 90s, when a lot of unfortunate things had happened in the 80s. And after all of that, there was this sense of, okay, we're on our own. We better make this work. And you felt that. And quite frankly, I was proud to be involved with that. I was proud to see that change. I was proud to see the country come along so strongly from the mid-'80s, when it was kind of, a remote kind of place to be. And then suddenly by the 90s, things are really picking up and humming. And of course, by now it's really humming. So
absolutely.
I was proud to be part of it. I was proud to have made a contribution to it. And that's something that my fellow Americans think I'm crazy to say, but that's why I wrote a book called The Mao of Business.
Right, and that's we spoke a little offline, and that book is sadly not available via Kindle, so I couldn't grab it here. But I am familiar with it in general, and I found some excerpts online. It leads to another question about what are some tips that you do or would give to better help outsiders to kind of most respectfully and effectively walk among the locals, as it were, in terms of business. And we'll get into a little bit of the more esoteric stuff afterward, but just kind of nuts and bolts perhaps right now.
Sure. Well, I wrote The Mao of Business because I became sort of upset that so many people were writing books about how to do business in China who had never been to China and never negotiated a contract, right? And they would write books like The Tao of Business or The Tao of Doing Business in China, always referencing the Tao. And, when I was in China in the 80s, no one had ever heard of the Tao.
Exactly.
I actually found myself in a position of actually trying to explain to a Chinese person what the yin and the yang were.
Right,
I mean,
right.
It was surreal.
Yeah. Westerners don't often know the difference between Taoism and Buddhism, and that they're not to tangent, but please continue.
Right. Well, yeah. But Mao, of course, everybody in China knows. And I was telling people, stop with the Tao stuff. Number one, it doesn't play.
Right.
Number two, you've never been to China. You don't speak Mandarin, and you've never negotiated a contract in China. How can you tell people how to do business in China if you haven't been bloodied, in the process? And I do mean bloodied in the process. So I decided, okay, I'm going to write a book about doing business in China, but I'm going to use the Little Red Book and Mao's writings in general to give a different approach, a different framework. And I'm telling my Western colleagues, yes, everything you've heard about Mao is true, but there's a lot you haven't heard about Mao that's also true. And there's the good Mao and the bad Mao, and you've got to come to terms with the fact that he's basically the George Washington of China. So you're going to have to, get around it, deal with it in a sort of proactive, positive way. You can't go into China and business people do this all the time, or they used to, particularly engineers, and I could do an hour just on engineers going to China.
Sure.
They are arrogant. They are...
No.
They isolate themselves, from the culture, from the people. They don't like anything. And I learned the hard way. I learned on the ground with in that first 3 months what not to do, what to do in China. How to handle even basic, simple things, like handing a business card,
Sure.
or receiving these basic etiquette things that Americans simply don't know and don't care. But then it got worse. It got to the point of they didn't know how to handle sitting down at a banquet. And didn't your mother bring you up better than that, than to sit down at the head of the table and start eating? Don't you?
Wow.
Don't you wait for everybody? I mean, come on, guys. Seriously. So
yeah, I still always let someone seat me if
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, unless I'm initiating the dinner,
Right.
Where do I sit? I probably have an idea now. The difference is I have a good guess of where I'm going to land, but it's out of my hands.
Well, exactly. So you just have to be, and going through a door,
Yeah,
You
sure.
never go through a door first, right? So I would be with Americans, with businessmen and engineers at the end of a business meeting, and there's one door, and there's like 30 of us, right? And so I'm waiting for other people to go out first, and then, of course, the leader of the Chinese delegation says, oh, no, you go out first. And I say, no, you go out first. And then it turns into the tug of war where I'm grabbing him, he's grabbing me, and we're forced through the door. You know this. You've seen it 100 times. But Americans have not seen it, and they don't like it, and they get upset by it. And I was accused of all sorts of things. I was accused of being, a communist or something because I would follow cultural norms in that country, and I'm saying you're selling to China.
Exactly.
Try to understand. So my first advice is when you go to China, the first thing to keep in your mind is it's not about you. China is not about you. It's not about your ideas about China. It's not your ideas about their religion or their politics, their economics. It's not about you. You don't know anything about China. And when you go to China, you go to China the first time, and how many times have people gone to China for 2 weeks and come back and figure they're experts, right? There's that syndrome that starts.
Yeah.
I'm an old China hand because I was there, a couple of weeks ago. So there's that. It's not about you. It's not about your preconceptions. There's a virtual China. And the virtual China has been created by Western media. It's kung fu movies, and it's horrible Chinese restaurants in the United States, with inedible food, that Chinese people just cannot eat when I bring them to the States. It's a whole bunch of ideas about Mao and about the revolution and about everything, and it's virtual. It's not the real China. It's a virtual China. It's a packaged China, and it's got a lot of preconceptions in there. It's got a lot of false information and spin that's totally wrong. So forget all that. If you're going to China, just listen. Don't talk. Just listen. Try to learn as much as you possibly can, and don't confuse the fact that China has technology and smartphones and all the rest of it. Don't confuse that with Western values. Don't think that suddenly they become quote unquote Westernized because they have computers, right?
Totally.
That's not what happened. Okay, don't confuse these things, because we do in the States. We glorify ourselves. We glorify our technology. We associate it with American values and with democracy and the Constitution and all this other stuff. And quite often don't know what we're talking about. So we go to China and we think, well, you've all become Westernized. You're all like us now. The richness of Chinese culture is so vast. And it changes from province to province, and it changes sometimes from village to village. You cannot make all these assumptions, and you can't operate on assumptions. Just take your time, pay attention, listen. Just try not to be the ugly American. Just do what you can.
I always say that's. I've said it on this show a lot. Actually, that's my default goal is to not be an ugly American in general wherever I travel, but especially here while we're at this kind of inflection point about the relationship internationally, et cetera. So I definitely relate to that.
Yeah, well, I agree 100%. I've been humiliated so many times by bringing people from the States into China who've just embarrassed me completely by things they said or did. People who should have known better, people who are mature adults, behaving stupidly, behaving arrogantly, particularly. they don't understand that you don't go into somebody's house and punch a bunch of holes in the walls,
Right.
and cut off their water and their electricity and then say to them, why are you living like this? You don't do that, okay? You have to accept some responsibility for what happened. I don't mean individually.
Sure.
But you have to understand that the relationship between foreign countries and China has been such that China has not always benefited from those relationships.
Exactly.
And, so just calm down, take it easy, and, try not to make matters worse. Just, enjoy the country because it's such a vast place of contradictions and energy and, different cultural perceptions. Learn from that and come back to the States and look at the States with different eyes. Look at your own country differently, which is one of the best things about traveling.
Absolutely. Well, that actually leads me to my next question, and you've already covered a lot of the points that were in my mind when I kind of wrote this, but you talked about this in my own words, that a lot of people for many years had sort of a baked-in assumption that success in business enterprises here would be won by just having more advanced technology or quote-unquote superior business practices with a little sprinkling of cultural awareness on top. And, that is evolving, and the people I deal with, are not trapped in that kind of mindset. But to me, it seems that understanding the fundamental realities of the, kind of Chinese psyche is still the most important thing you need to master if you want to work here. I'm curious, how do you feel that the so-called material basis framework applies to China? What are maybe the shortcomings of that, and what lens would you propose that people view China through to best understand it? There's a lot there, but how would you? What does that prompt you to say?
Well, it prompts me to say a number of things. Number one, there's no such place as China as a monolith, right? Everywhere you go is different. Every place you go, it's monolithic in the sense of a centralized government, a centralized economy to a certain extent. And the emphasis on Mandarin as the language of choice. But these are things that are imposed by government. If you go from place to place in China, you're going to find different Chinas.
Right.
So you have to be aware of that. It's just as bad to go to China and think it's all one thing as it is for a Chinese person to go to Ohio, that's New York. And it's just there's just so much difference in our country, but in China that's magnified because of the language differences and a lot of cultural differences. So the first thing I think, as a foreigner going there, you have to realize that is, true. However, to us, the difference is so great between, talking as an American, between America and China, culturally, politically, historically, that it might as well be one thing, because you're going to have to approach it that way at first. You're going to have to approach it very cautiously. You cannot make assumptions about China. It's the first thing that you learn is that any assumptions you had, you're going to be relieved of when you're there for any length of time. It may look like a place where anything goes, but it's not.
Sure.
You have to be careful. You have to obey the laws. You have to be conscious of all of that, all of the things you would be conscious of in any country. But what I have found with Americans is they get kind of crazy when they go to Asia, in general. And that's really tough to deal with. I had a lot of problems with people who worked for me in China who were Americans because they did go crazy. They thought everything was cool, and it wasn't. So trying to rein everybody back and give these long lectures as to you're supposed to do this and you can't do that and you can't say this and you can't do that. So that it took most of my time trying to acclimate people to the environment of China, and the business environment as well is a different environment. Negotiations are conducted quite differently than they are in the States.
Absolutely.
It's a little bit better now, but back in the 80s, you didn't just walk into a conference room and start talking business. That was rude and just was not going to happen.
Not even the first meeting so much.
No.
Yeah, the first meeting is definitely more of a courtship, and you get to it eventually if people are interested and serious. But they need to know that it's a lot like building relationships in entertainment in a sense, although there's obviously more of a transactional nature to that. I've talked a lot on the show about you cannot approach things in a transactional manner here. You have to focus on building the relationships, and it's a cliche, but people don't understand how people seem to disregard it and think, oh, that's, that doesn't apply still. Well, no, that applies as much as it ever has.
It's a cliche for a reason.
Exactly. Right.
And it is very important. And if you do, the other side of that is, if you do build good relationships, they're going to last you for a while. Mm-hmm. You may not get the contract this time, but you may get it the next time because of the relationships you've built. You have to think long term in China. You cannot go there and make a quick buck and leave. And that's something we've been trying to tell people forever. And at one point, I brought a bunch of engineers and executives from a company from Ohio, as it turns out, involved in the rubber business.
Okay.
And we went to China. We had this beautiful, we were really trying to build a factory there to make tires, to make rubber moldings and that kind of thing for automobiles, for Volkswagen, Shanghai, as it turned out. Mm-hmm. So we're there making these presentations, and China had already started to change. From the 80s, it's now the 90s. And now suddenly everybody's getting a lot more savvy as to how to handle these things. Not the Americans, the Chinese.
Right.
So my guys are there, and they're, they are willing to invest money of their own money in this factory, and they want to invest, millions of dollars in building this factory. Just as long as they get the order, they want to invest the money in everything else. And for the first time, I heard an executive from the Chinese side sort of smile and look at the executive from the American side and say, "That's okay, we don't need your money."
Okay.
And that floored this guy, right? He thought he was going to be the white knight, no pun intended,
right,
who was going to come in, with bags of money and, basically do another opium war. Here's the money. I'm going to build this factory. You guys are going to work for me, and everything's going to be fine, right? And their attitude was, no, I don't think so. Forget the money, keep your money. We don't want your investment. We're fine. And that was the sea change. That was like the major change.
Sure.
And inwardly I'm laughing, but outwardly I'm trying to look grim and
well, yeah, sure. Have the appropriate game face, and you want to try to try to make the deal. So
right, yeah. As it turned out, we did not make the deal.
Yeah.
But that's another story. But that they came in thinking that they were going to just walk away with this project. It was the typical kind of approach that they had, and we were telling them from the beginning, just be careful, be cool. This is
sure.
is still a long process. But they kind of blew it there through arrogance. So what do I tell people? Look at China the way it is. It's a country, the equivalent of yours. If you're an American, you're used to thinking of other countries as always being inferior. But things are changing. And in China, America is not as powerful as it used to be. Right. We had an edge there in the 80s. And we even had somewhat of an edge there in the 90s. But as the 21st century rolled around, there's a lot of players. And in fact, when I go to South America, and I used to do business in South America, Europe, everywhere, I would go to South America, countries like Peru, and find out that my customers down there were Chinese. Okay. Chinese companies from China would go to Peru, set up mining operations, set up manufacturing operations. So now I'm sitting across from Chinese people in Peru and other places all throughout Latin America. The investments of China abroad are breathtaking right now. Yeah. They are doing a tremendous amount of business overseas. We are missing all of that for a lot of reasons. And get serious, people. We're dealing with a country that, could eat your lunch. They've been doing business for 5,000 years.
Exactly. Right. They've been a mercantile society for millennia.
Exactly. And, they know how to do it. And they know how to do it better than you do. It's just that for a while, they were kind of on the ropes for a lot of reasons economically. Now they're not so much on the ropes, So now they're going to do business the way they've been doing it, the way they know how to do it. You have to get up to speed. If we're just talking about business, right? You have to get up to speed. They don't have to get up to speed anymore to the American style of doing business. That's just not as necessary as it was 30 years ago.
Well, you sort of address this, and to give a roadmap of where we're going, sort of have kind of one more business piece to wrap this up, and then I want to talk a bit about space, and then big picture as we when we get toward concluding, which we're nowhere near if you have the time. Are you okay on time?
No problem.
Okay.
I'm okay.
Great, thank you. I do have a few episodes that are an hour and a half, so we'll see how you're doing.
We may get there. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm happy to do it if you've got the time. So you addressed this a bit in what you just said. I had written the question What does the West need to understand about China's sense of self, it's China's sense of itself, in order to best cooperate with minimal antagonism? Or do you think antagonism is institutionally baked into the Western point of view in terms of looking eastward? And I'm curious, especially about the second part of that. I mean, and I think, I have my own answer for that, but what do you think about that question? Do you think antagonism is something that is part of our DNA from the West, and how do we overcome that or get rid of it or transcend it?
Well, it's interesting because in the current political and cultural climate in the United States, we're dealing with a very serious problem that we've never really had to address before. We've never really looked at it before.
Sure.
But we have to do it now. Colonial attitudes are not easy to walk back. We have a kind of colonialist attitude towards other countries. Will they serve us? Will they do what we want them to do? We routinely, talk about other countries that they shouldn't deal with China. They should deal with us. There's absolutely no reason for other countries to deal with us if China's giving them a better deal, right? If they're making investments and their products are less expensive or whatever the negotiated contracts are, there's no particular reason why they shouldn't do that, why other countries shouldn't do that. But we have the sense of affront. If Peru buys equipment from China instead of from the United States, we think that there's a problem with that. We've stopped thinking in terms of actually doing business in the transactional way that you're referring to. We think that people should do business with us because we're Americans. And that attitude is not easy to walk back. So when we're dealing with China, we have this sort of built-in sense of superiority. It may not be antagonism, but it turns into antagonism when our superiority is not met with reverence, right? So when the people, when they react, when they push back, then we get antagonistic, right? It's like being in an abusive relationship. So then we get antagonistic, and then we get nasty, Why aren't you bowing down to us? And I'm not knocking the United States. We've done a lot of great things over the years, but our relationships with foreign countries have pretty much always been do what we tell you to do.
Right.
And if we don't like your government, we may try to do something about it. Or if we don't like this, we're going to do something about it. Or we're going to punish you for this or for that. So there's been this attitude of that it's not really about business. It's not really about an honest exchange, foreign trade. It's not about, open borders and all the rest of this stuff where money is concerned and trade. It isn't, There's this emphasis on you should buy it from us even if we're more expensive. Mm-hmm. And we'll have the excuse of, well, our technology is better. Maybe not.
That's not going to hold. Yeah, so it's not so much anymore, and it's not going to hold. No. Let me flip this around, because despite all of our horrible problems, I am still a very proud American as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm, and of course I'm in the middle of, the early days of China's, more visible rise, which will be, I think, the paradigm for the rest of my lifetime. But it's not going to be a linear graph. It's not probably going to be a smooth path. I'm interested about any thoughts you would have as far as how the dominant resting belief systems here in China are likely to be the most tested in the coming years as they sort of ascend and assume a different, speaking of seats at the table, as they sort of look for a new seat at the table.
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't want to make any assumptions that there is an overreaching China narrative where the world in the future is concerned. I've been watching, of course, very carefully everything that they're doing on the international scene, and I'm still involved in business peripherally. Mm-hmm. And so I see things that are changing, attitudes that are changing. But I don't think that we can point to any one thing and say, well, this is where China is going, this is their intention. I think that there are still people of my generation who think of China in terms of communism. And quite often they don't really understand communism in the first place. when they make that assumption, but they'll jump to that. They'll jump to communism, they'll jump to Marxism, Leninism with Chinese characteristics. They'll do all of this without really understanding the meaning behind the words or the reality on the ground.
Exactly.
And it's the reality on the ground that's important. And the Chinese are demonstrating, to my way of thinking, they're demonstrating pragmatism. They're demonstrating a devotion to a long-term process whereby they protect their borders, whereby they protect their economy, where they enrich the country. It doesn't have to be at the expense of other countries. I don't see China becoming a colonial power necessarily. Right. I think there's so much interior colonization they have to do yet. I think there's a lot of, there's vulnerabilities within the country economically and with the social, situation of people in the countryside and some of the problems in the city and all of these things. There's a lot that has to be dealt with, and I think the Chinese want to deal with that first. I think they're really focused on that. There's a sense of nationalism there and of making China just this perfect place for all the Chinese.
Right.
So I think it's focused more on that than it is on kicking somebody else in some other country. And I don't see them really getting a lot of joy out of, kicking other people around. But that said, I have spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, and there's a lot of Chinese immigration to that part of the world. And I have seen there's been some pushback from local people, even local Chinese, against people from China, because there's this sort of an attitude of we're superior and you guys were the diaspora, you guys left,
right.
And now we're the lords of the matter. And that's not going to play well either, Exactly. So there's two sides to this, and that doesn't work in Singapore, it doesn't work in Malaysia or Indonesia or any of these places that have a Chinese minority. It doesn't work well with the local people either, obviously. But the Chinese are able to sort of play the game when it comes to dealing with Malays or Javanese. But when it comes to Chinese, then you can see this sort of attitude of arrogance come out, and that'll be a little dangerous. That's going to cause some pushback in the countries in Southeast Asia that really want to work with China, and they're telling their people to learn Mandarin, to stop speaking, Hokkien or Cantonese, and they're trying to get people on board with Greater China. But at the same time, there's a lot of pushback against some of the attitudes and some of the people, frankly, that are migrating to that part of the world. So there's and I've seen it in action, and I understand it, and I know what's going on, and try to stay out of it because it doesn't concern me.
Sure. Yeah, I don't want to, and I don't want to drag us into anything that we can't. I appreciate your perspective. I mean, it does seem like more, like a more carrot, less stick approach would be better. Would win the hearts and minds. I'll try to cram as many cliches as possible into that sentence. It's a gift, really, Peter. But I appreciate your thoughts. Let me shift gears. I will end up coming back to geopolitical power structure stuff when we wrap. But I do want to take a little detour that actually will get us right back into it. And I want to give some context for the audience. My question is going to be this, but then I want to backfill this for the sake of people who don't live and breathe this to the degree that you do or that I'm familiar with it. The question will be basically, what do you see as China's role in space, and how do they fit into the overall narrative? Let me give some context from my point of view, but I would mostly, of course, rather hear your thoughts. You have done a lot of work recently in the last several years with Tom DeLonge on this To the Stars initiative. And for the sake of people who are not familiar, in my words, it really seeks to demystify the UFO phenomenon. And that has brought you greater worldwide attention from corners where you are already well known. And so again, for context, there are a lot of narratives about orbiting the UFO topic, small pun intended. And, generally speaking, I think you could class that as, on one hand, saying that UFOs are the result, like actual visits or contact from, benevolent or malevolent space brothers with galactic technology. And then on the other sort of view of this is that, many, if not all of the non-provably hoaxed events are actually elements of the secret space program of the U.S., which has gotten a ton of press lately, outside of China. And you've spoken and written about this, for years, of course. So again, in my words, basically that narrative posits that there are, hangars that contain flying saucers and other really highly advanced tech that's been developed by, Raytheon, McDonnell Douglas, and all these other military industrial leaders, things that are unknown to the general public. But of course, this is how you develop military technology. You do it in secret, and it takes decades. So that's my setup, again, kind of more for the audience sake. So what do you see as China's role moving into space, and do they fit into that overall narrative, or is this really kind of two separate worlds from your point of view?
No, I think when it comes to space, there's a lot of congruence between what America is trying to do, what Europe is trying to do, Russia and China. I think the conquest of space involves pretty much identical technologies. I mean, different tweaking of those technologies, and maybe there'll be some innovation from either side, in the next couple of years. But the China space program, to me, is a stunning accomplishment for a country which, basically had no space program to begin with, didn't have weapons of mass destruction back in the 40s and 50s and all of that. So there is something that, China's really been aggressive about, but it's the history of the China space program that really interests me. It's a fascinating thing. I know that they've set up this elaborate, radio telescope out in Guizhou province, right? Mm-hmm. So it's going to be the largest sort of search for extraterrestrial intelligence program in the world. And it may be that they're the first ones to get, the messaging. If there is, signals being sent to us from some other planet somewhere, it may be that China is the first one to get the signal. And if they are, is China going to share that with the rest of the world? We have excluded China. When I say we, America and the other countries have excluded China from the International Space Station, right? Right. So we have Russians on the space station, we have Japanese, we have everybody else. But the Chinese were never allowed to be part of the International Space Station, and that, in my estimation, was a big mistake. Sure. But I mean, it was just a slap in the face of political error. I think it was wrong to do that, to exclude them. We have Russia building half of it, right? Right. And the space shuttles were taking off from Kazakhstan, out from a Russian base, and the space shuttle had Russian-made, engines on it. And why would we exclude China? It didn't make sense to me. It still doesn't make sense to me. So China went and did their own thing, right? So they have their own space laboratory, and they're sending people into orbit, and they're orbiting, and they're getting ready to orbit the moon and to land, lunar landers on the far side of the moon. Mm-hmm. So all of this is taking place at the same time that, we have Elon Musk doing his thing. Right. And NASA kind of here and there, not really being full speed ahead yet because of all the political stuff that's going on right now. So I see that China may be competing with Elon Musk more than SpaceX than it's going to compete with NASA. That may be, and because Musk has a great marketing, approach to all of this, and he's made it glamorous and he's made it exciting. And I think that the Chinese understand that. And if you're going to compete with somebody, compete with that guy. So it may be that we're going to see a kind of a shift in the Chinese space program for the better. But one thing that always fascinated me, though, and I want to get back, is if I can talk just briefly, please, is the beginning of the China space program. And the United States did that. They screwed up royally. And we had a guy called, well, in English, H.S. Hsien.
Yeah, is it Jian Shusen?
Yeah, exactly. And here's this guy, Chen, who was a brilliant scientist, a rocket scientist, brilliant guy. He worked for Theodore von Karman. And Theodore von Karman was, again, a brilliant, engineer, a space engineer, the first person to get the award, the National Medal of Science from Jack Kennedy, the first one ever awarded. Von Karman is a brilliant guy. But it's the end of World War II. And the Nazis have not yet surrendered. They're about to. France has fallen back to the Allies, et cetera, et cetera. All this is going on. Von Karman takes Tian with him to Europe to interrogate Nazi war criminals, the ones who were involved in the rocket programs at Peenemünde and all those places. So there's Tian, and he's there with it. He's a trusted, valued member of our military efforts to defeat Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. And he's there to learn all that he possibly can about the Nazi space program. All of this is cool. All this is great. He's coming back. They're writing reports. And von Karman actually is also a consultant to Project Sign, which is one of the earliest UFO projects. He's writing memos to that as well. All this stuff is going on. And then the McCarthy era happens.
Mm-hmm.
So by about 1950, suddenly, Tien is suspected of being a communist spy or an agent for China. Red China, as they used to call it in those days. And he's arrested. Here's this guy who helped jumpstart our space program in the United States. He was one of a handful of rocket scientists that we had at a time when nobody really cared much about rocket science. It was him and a handful of other guys. It was maybe 6 people, max, working out of the Jet Propulsion Lab, that created the Jet Propulsion Lab in California,
right,
in Pasadena. And suddenly, he's lost his security clearance. He's arrested. He's placed under house arrest by the FBI. He's being investigated as being a communist. Eventually, they find out, well, they didn't have anything to hold him on. He was just a Chinese scientist, or a scientist with a Chinese background. So he's disgusted, right? He goes to China then, because everybody assumed he was anyway. So he says, if I have the name, might as well have the game. And he got on a plane, went to Beijing and said, here I am, let's jumpstart our space program. And he did,
Yeah.
He's a fascinating person, and it's a complete, it's a thumbnail history of what we in this country do wrong often. We go nuts over something. We get paranoid. We see anarchists under the bed. We see communists in the closets.
Right.
And we go nuts, and we take these extreme measures, and all we do is help other people. We help people that we consider our enemies, and we give them aid and comfort this way. So Tien Lin did that, and towards the last years of his life, he became very much involved in esoteric subjects. And he started to publish on Qi, the movement of Qi and Qigong and that sort of thing. He started to write about, paranormal things and UFOs to a certain extent as well. And, our, NSA is like massively trying to track this guy and find out what he's writing about. And they're translating his articles into English. They've been declassified, recently. And here he was a visionary. He was a guy who was a real visionary, a scientist, but somebody who, because of the origins, because of what he went through, seeing the Nazi stuff, seeing everything else and how we dealt with it, he became somebody who was a brilliant mind, who then applied that brilliance not just to the space program, but also to, developing, of course, the silkworm. He's credited with that as well, the silkworm. And but also for becoming involved in the paranormal, like so many scientists, in this country now with that To the Stars project, as you know, with Tom DeLonge. We've got scientists now, people who have backgrounds in physics, people who have backgrounds in chemistry and astrophysics, who are very much, involved in the whole UFO thing. And as you say, demystifying the UFO phenomenon and getting to the bottom of that and being involved in the remote viewing experiments and all of this. So there's this camaraderie, this kind of collegiality among a certain set of scientists and people involved in esoterica, and that crosses all international boundaries.
Sure, Jack Parsons was,
Well, I didn't want to bring him up. I didn't know about your listeners.
Well, we won't go down that rabbit hole. I'm actually going to, I was just, that's more for you to say that, of course, starting from him, and he's basically the origin. Yeah. He's one of the founders of the JPL, and he was also a wild and woolly occultist for all of you straight-laced listeners of mine. That's a whole other topic. What I'm going to do also, just as a side note, I want to come back to the Stars, but I will also ask you for links to anything you would like me to include when we get to that point, and I'll put those in the show notes. And I have several specifically for people who are curious to do like the deeper dive. I will link to a couple of either podcasts or presentations that you've done, or some sites where if anyone is really curious about some of this more esoteric stuff, they can go crazy and have a blast. But as far as To the Stars, what was really fascinating was, and I subscribe to the New York Times digital edition, and so one morning I woke up here in Beijing, a month or so ago, and realized, and I was having these alerts, and then on the very front page, top story was about the recent UFO disclosure and being credited to the Stars in the work. Can you tell me what has happened just in the very recent past, what has kind of been the outcome, and what's your take on how this these updates to the narrative are being received? What's the impact of all this?
Wow, that's
Well, I mean, you can give us the short version, of course.
Have you ever known me to give a short version of it?
Well, that's the Levenda short version.
The Levenda short version.
Right.
Well, this is the thing, okay? I thought that those announcements were pretty much earth-shattering. I mean, it was front page of the Times digital edition, but it was also everywhere. Everybody was talking about it. Every media outlet picked up this story and treated it seriously. It was the U.S. government coming out, or people who had worked for the U.S. government coming out and saying, yes, UFOs are real. By the way, here's some videos, here's some documentation about it. Here's this guy who worked on the project. By the way, there's an American Senator, Harry Reid, who funded this project initially. There was the other senators who were involved. This is how long it ran. It's still going on under a different funding operation. And I thought, this is it. Everybody's been screaming about disclosure. We want to know, is it true? Are there UFOs? Well, here it is. These people coming out and saying, well, yeah, And the former Undersecretary of Defense, a guy who worked at the Pentagon, scientists who were attached, who knew intimately about these things going on, people who had security clearances, and they're all coming out and saying, yeah, actually, there are UFOs. We know that there's UFOs. And people treated it seriously, and it's becoming normalized. It's been taking a while, but since those announcements in December until now, there are now more and more and more stories coming out about UFO sightings, but they're starting to appear in more mainstream media.
Right.
And people are taking it seriously. They're saying, well, look at this, or look at that. Maybe this is true. Does this have anything to do with it? The people who reacted most vociferously against it were people in the UFO community itself.
Mm-hmm. Right.
These are people who said,
why do you think that is?
Trust these guys.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of reasons. One is they've been lied to so often.
Sure.
That they're just gun shy, and they're not going to, jump on board with something, especially if it has U.S. government written all over. The problem with that point of view is that where else is disclosure going to come from?
Exactly.
Right? Where's it going to come from? Disneyland, right? It's going to come from the U.S. government. It's going to come from people who know, people who were there, people who are saying, yes, we studied this. Yes, these are real things. We don't know what they are. They defy any kind of science that we know.
Right.
So they came out and said that, and the UFO community said, well, we can't trust you. This is a money-making scheme. Tom DeLonge's trying to get your money.
A guy who arguably, of anyone who's ever been involved in the UFO world, less needs your money. The one guy, exactly. He was, again, people who aren't familiar, he was, founder of the band Blink-182 and had other bands, rich rock star guy. He doesn't do this because he needs the money.
Exactly, right. And the only money he's asking for are investments in a company, which shares that you can buy and sell, right? So he's not saying, send me $10, I'll send you a prayer shawl or something, or something, some oil to put on your head. This is a guy saying, we're going to do this stuff. We're going to build these ships. We're going to do this other stuff. And they just attacked mercilessly. And it was almost funny, but very, demoralizing. Here are the people who should be happiest about what's taking place. And now they're shooting it down because they're comfortable with the status quo. They've been lied to so often. They're kind of comfortable with that. Don't tell us the truth now. We like, the lies that we've been told.
Sure,
we've been conned.
Sure.
And, we've invested in those cons. And no, we don't, we think we're okay with that. Don't come out and tell us that it's really true, because you must have an ulterior motive for it. And you're just trying to manipulate us again. And they were manipulated. And the Air Force, particularly, through a guy called Richard Doty, came out and manipulated like crazy. He lied, to people in the UFO community. He told them all sorts of stories. He manipulated people to the end of their days. It was heinous, and just awful what this guy, this agent who worked for OSI at the Air Force, was able to do and willing to do to innocent people. And so, yes, the UFO community is gun shy. They don't, but the difference is we've come out. When I say we, I don't really speak for To the Stars. I'm a writer that writes books with them. But people who are coming out and talking about this have verifiable names and pedigrees, and we know who they are.
Right.
There's no mystery here. There's nobody hiding behind, a fake name or a fake identity like Doty did. These are guys coming out and saying, okay, this is my background, this is who I am, here's my photograph, this is my resume, this is what I've done, and I'm telling you UFOs are real. And that still isn't good enough, So it's interesting. We're going to watch and see what happens. There's more stuff that's coming out, So there's going to be more revelations and more releases of more stuff. And it's people are complaining it's a trickle. There's a reason for that. It's because this is not easy to do. There's people's jobs on the line, their reputation on the line quite often. People are taking risks in some cases. In other cases, there's just a lot of red tape and paperwork to get some of this stuff released. A lot of it's not really classified. But just because it's not classified doesn't mean you have access to it.
Right.
It's in a drawer somewhere with a lock on it, So just because it's not classified doesn't mean it's in the public domain on a website someplace. It's not. We have to get at this stuff. None of my personal life is classified, but do not go looking at and trying to hack my identity or something, right?
Right.
So this is basically it's like that. Everybody has their life, and everybody has a certain amount of classification, quote unquote, that they would like around their life. But the same thing is true with the Pentagon. There's a lot of material there. It's not classified necessarily, not all of it. A lot of it is, but a lot of it isn't. And it's a question of getting that stuff out of the greasy little fingers that are holding on to it and don't want to get rid of it and don't want to release it to the world. But, it happens and it has to happen in its own way. And that's just the name of the game. But it's happening. It's already happened. And guess what? Tom DeLonge didn't charge anybody any money for those videos that were released. So it's not like there's, you could buy the New York Times and read all about it.
Absolutely. Well, I will include links to that, as I said, and it's not to do a whole show about it because again, it's a bit off brand for Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom, but in terms of China's ascending in their space program again currently, it'll be interesting. What happens with the U.S. space program, and your point, especially that they're really competing with Elon Musk, is one that I was going to make if you hadn't brought it up. So,
okay. Sorry about that.
No, please. You're the guest. I'd rather hear it from you. So let me shift gears as we're sort of shifting into the end of this, but I have a few questions that are all sort of a piece, and so let me kind of set the table conversationally for what I'd like your thoughts on, and you don't have to answer a specific question, but maybe just your general thoughts on this. So without getting us into too much trouble, right, and keeping our visas intact, I'm interested, a lot has been made, of course, about the deep state, so-called, in the U.S., and I'm wondering if you could hazard a guess about the philosophical underpinnings and goals of maybe the equivalent of that here. A related question, which may be the easier one to tackle, is I'm wondering, how do you see the relationship between what are often called the Atlanticist power structures and the Asian power structures? How do you see that relationship evolving, both kind of in the relatively near term and then maybe, say 50 years down the track?
The deep state meme is tricky because everybody means something different by it. I think it came out basically because Peter Dale Scott was writing about the deep politics. Mm-hmm. And deep politics is that nexus between not just politics the way we know it, but also with organized crime, the intelligence agencies, politicians, scientists, old money, certain banking institutions, and the military to a certain extent. So there's a kind of a number of individuals that are sort of behind all of that. You'll have a banker who's good friends with a general, who's good friends with somebody in the intelligence world, and as well with someone in organized crime, and you have the beginnings of the deep state there. So you have people who can control events or believe they can control events. These are not people who are elected. These are people who are in their positions for life usually, and they run things the way they want to run things. It's a kind of a naive approach to understanding the way the U.S. government works. You have a lot of government employees. I mean, they're not elected, they're just there. Washington is a big government employee operation. So there are people there who've lived in Washington all their lives, and they've worked there all their lives, and the presidents come and go, and administrations come and go, but they keep doing their jobs. And there's this idea that that constitutes a deep state. Well, not really. If you've really dealt with the government on a level like that, there's nothing deep state-ish about them. They're just bureaucrats trying to punch their clocks and get their paycheck and fighting over their next GS scale raise. So it's like that. I mean, it's not a bunch of nefarious people trying to destroy somebody. So I think we don't understand it. And I think if we don't understand it in the States, how would we ever really identify it in China, as an example? Is there a deep state in China? Well, you've got the military, and you've got intelligence agencies and the Public Security Bureau, and you've got, wealthy individuals, and, you have the triads to a certain extent, So maybe there's a deep state-ish kind of operation there as well. But that's, again, I think that's really hard to prove. So it's more a question of, if there's a U.S. deep state, would they be able to identify, collaborate with, or fight against a Chinese deep state? And my answer to that is probably not. If only because there's so little information that comes in the United States direction from the way things work in China. Who's on top? Who's controlling what? Who's really the power behind the throne in any particular case? And these things kind of change, and there's families involved in there. I mean, for a while back in the 80s, there was this talk that maybe, there was still a kind of a warlord division of, political power in China. All these things were talked about, but nobody knew, and nobody really had any hard evidence. And on top of that, this changed quite dramatically in China. The economic growth in that country has been explosive, and that's going to change the parameters of any kind of quote-unquote deep state you'd want to think about. So I think the only possible way to look at this is, is there conflict between us and China, between the West in general and China? Is there real conflict? Is there political conflict? Or is there just economic conflict, Or is the economic conflict the mask for political confrontation? I think there's economic conflict, but that's our own damn fault, right? I think it's up to us to be better salespeople. It's up to us to cut better deals, to be more, to be less quote-unquote American about certain things, not to be the ugly American that goes there and tells everybody what to do. I think if we redesign our approach to business, and I'm speaking as somebody who did that overseas for like 30 years, if we can adjust our attitudes where that's concerned and look at business work a lot harder, certainly, but look at business in a much more proactive way of building those relationships and cutting back all of the baggage that we've brought to those countries over the years, and just rework all of this and build genuine relationships in those countries. We're going to cut across any of these political problems as we cut down the economic problems. China will still be an economic powerhouse. I don't see that going away. So we have to take that into consideration. Maybe we should cut better deals, with China when it comes to doing business in foreign countries. Maybe there's room to build partnerships. But it's going to take a while to get to that point, because right now there's just too much suspicion on all sides. But it's pointless, I don't see China being a military threat to the United States anytime soon. It's possible there's going to be military conflicts in the region, but again, I don't see China valuing that over their economic growth and stability. Right. I think that comes first. I think that comes first in China. That's my impression.
I definitely have that opinion myself. I don't have the background of scholarship to bank it on, so I'm glad to hear your take on it, and I hope that's the case. I'm optimistic that's the case. I do want to be respectful of your time, because I could keep talking with you very happily, but I want to ask you sort of one last question, and then we'll get some links and things. And this question is, if you had to place your entire family's fortunes for the next generation on a macro bet related to China, what area would that most likely be focused on? I'd really love to hear your top few predictions for the future. For China, whether domestically or how they, the role in the world stage, et cetera.
Well, I think that to build on what we were just talking about, the idea of soft power versus hard power, I think that China right now is using a lot of soft power, and I think they're getting better at it than we are, and that's kind of troubling. There's a lack of faithfulness to the soft power approach right now in Washington. That's considered to be, I don't know, just not manly enough or something. I'm not sure what the problem is. But I think soft power, I think China has been really developing that very strongly. I think they prefer the soft power approach, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. They need their armies, they need the defense capabilities and all of that. And of course they have been engaging in little adventures here and there. But I think that for the most part on the world stage, China prefers to use the soft power approach. And they're outplaying us where that's concerned right now anyway. I think we had the upper hand some years ago, but now I think we're kind of losing it. And soft power is going to be, I think, where China gets its major success in the next few years. It's going to be in convincing nations of their good faith, in demonstrating that by developing their infrastructures, by making investments. And China's not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're expecting to make money on all of these investments, but by the same token, they're willing to take the risk. They're willing to go pretty much the extra mile further than we have been lately. So I think that's going to be a success for China. I think their economic penetration of developing nations is what's going to give China a lot of strength, because those developing nations today, they're going to be developed nations tomorrow. And they're going to be strong countries tomorrow, and they're going to go back and say, well, thank you, China. They may not be saying thank you, United States, and that is for an American, that's kind of a worrying proposition. It means we're getting more and more isolated, and we're playing less and less of a role on the world stage. Now, there's a lot of Americans who don't want to play a role on the world stage. They're back to the isolationist framework we had in the 1930s, and I think that's wrong. I mean, as somebody who's spent my whole life traveling overseas and living overseas for years, it's wrong to do that. It doesn't make any sense. We have to be engaged, and then China understands that engagement, and they're doing it. They're doing it pretty well. And the third thing probably I'd like to talk about is just mention, we already talked about it, is their space technology.
Right.
I think their approach to space is something that we've forgotten about. NASA and the space program and the Apollo program did a great thing for the United States, for their ego, if nothing else, for bragging rights, for pride in the country, what we're able to accomplish, especially after the disastrous Sputnik thing, which put the Russians putting something into space before us, was a disaster for American. It just increased American paranoia no end. And I think that if we start taking a backseat to space, and we let China do that, it's going to be another problem for us, but it's going to be great for China. The bragging rights for putting a lunar lander on the other side of the moon, where Jack Parsons, by the way, has a crater named after him.
Right, right, exactly.
The old colleague of Mr. Chen. I think if they do that, that's going to give them tremendous bragging rights. It's going to make them a power in ways that we don't yet understand. The Apollo moon programs that we got involved with were a tremendous boost to our economy as well, and to our technology. We had to develop all kinds of technologies to support that program. A lot of stuff we had to do, not just the Tang orange juice.
Exactly. Yeah, all the technology trickled into industry. So
it's to everywhere. The return on investment is very great when it comes to the space program, and I think China understands that as well. I mean, there's some discussion as to, isn't it better to send robots into space than human beings? Financially speaking, there's a better return, and it's safer. But I think there's an understanding in China that we have to send people. We have to show a Chinese astronaut on the moon waving. I think that's really important, and I think they're going to accomplish that, and they may accomplish it within about 15 years. So I think they're close enough to get there. They're within striking distance. So these are the things that will change. The global look for a while. I mean, to have the Chinese on the moon, to have them really developing a lot of other nations, their economies and their infrastructure, and that whole soft power thing, they can make mistakes, and they could make mistakes in ways that they'll be criticized deeply if they do things wrong, if they get too militaristic in some ways, or if they do things, like that, they'll be criticized. They don't care, but they will be criticized, and that may take some of the wind out of their sails. And there's a lot of sort of pushback now against, certain things going on in the States with the
Sure.
Confucius House stuff. There's been
sure.
a lot of talk about that, and who knows? But my point is that on the world stage, China is poised to become extremely powerful, both in a propaganda sense, in the way we regard China globally, but also in a very real sense, as far as economy is concerned and economic penetration of other countries and developing other countries. The things that we said we did, during the post-war period, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the Marshall Plan and all of these things that we're so proud of, China's doing it on a day-to-day basis in countries whose names we can't even pronounce, and they're doing it, and they're doing it well. And it's going to change. It's going to change the dynamic on the world, and I think that's what's going to happen. You can't ignore this any longer. Napoleon famously said, "When China awakes, the world will tremble," and I think that's happening now.
Well, I think that is a fantastic place to leave it for now. Maybe we'll get to do a follow-up at some point and see how this is played out. Peter, I really appreciate your time. Are there any specific links or projects you'd like to point people to? And I will include links in the show notes, as I was saying.
Well, because of being involved with the Tom DeLonge project, I've had to get onto Facebook, which where
Yes,
you found me.
Exactly. That's how I tracked you down. We have a few common friends, actually, but that's how I reached out.
Well, Facebook and, Twitter and Instagram and all that good stuff. I'm on all of that. I have my own website, which is peterlevenda.com. I update it erratically. I mean, every once in a while I'll post something and get criticized for it and go quiet for a while. And, my books are available, of course, on Amazon and all the usual suspects.
Excellent. Peter, I really appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
Not at all.
All right, that is our show this week. I hope you enjoyed it and that you found it as entertaining and interesting as I did to have the conversation. Don't forget that all the links are available in the show notes. You can also learn more about Stackery by going to stackery.com or follow the link that is on the blog post. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.